Just as an introduction, good afternoon. My name is Lauren Cooper. I'm the lead of the Forest, Carbon, and Climate program here at Michigan State University in the Forestry Department. We're so pleased to lead this learning session for the Forest Climate Working Group. And for those of you that aren't familiar, the Forest Climate Working Group is a diverse group of forest interests, including landowners, industry, conservationists, academia, and those active with carbon markets. This group has worked together for more than 8 years to advocate for state and federal policies that work to ensure sustainable forest use and prevention of land use change. And I know we do have some folks from outside of the group, including some colleagues here in the forestry department and in our partnering organizations. So I thought I'd hand it over to Rich Jad, to greet the group and to introduce the group, the Forest Climate Working Group, more broadly.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Lauren. And I just want to start by thanking Leslie so much for joining us today. We're really excited to hear more about some of the innovative work at Washington State in Washington State, excuse me, to make this really important connection between forests and driving carbon mitigation through forests and forestry. Lauren did a great job of giving an overview of the Forest Climate Working Group. For those of you who are new, this coalition has been operating since late 2007, and we're really proud of the fact that over that whole history, we've had strong engagement from that broad diversity of interest across the whole forest sector that Lauren described. And one of the reasons why we're so excited about today's presentation is that while it's a complicated environment right now for forest and climate change at the federal level, and then some uncertainties around how policy is going to move forward at the federal level on these issues, we still see a lot of momentum at the state level and feel that the work that's being done in California and Washington State and other states that are trying to identify how can state policies incentivize the kind of forest carbon activities that we want to see on the landscape. We feel in the Forest Climate Working Group that that's a real opportunity for us to keep learning and keep building momentum around work in the forest sector on the connection between forest and climate change. So really looking forward to today's session as an opportunity to keep this learning and this dialogue moving forward. And we'll turn it back to Lauren and Leslie to take us forward.
Thanks so much, Jad. And like you said, we do have a really interesting presentation today. We're going to be looking at a specific incentive program for working forest lands in the state of Washington, and then also hear some more general conversation about forest carbon and its integration into policy in that state. So we have Leslie Connolly, Policy Specialist with the Washington State Recreation and Conservation Office, and she'll be announcing the new Forest Land Preservation Grant Program and share some of its early progress. It's really great timing because they've just reviewed their first round of applications for this program. And then she'll also discuss how carbon is built and carbon management is built into the grant activity targets. And really quickly though, before we start, I have a couple of details. The first is that this session is being recorded and it will be posted on the web along with any supplemental resources, including the presentation slides, in the next week or so. And so I'll alert you when we have this ready to go and with a link of where you'll be able to find it. And we are going to break for questions at a few points. So please feel free to send these questions along as they pop up. And again, apologies that I'm not able to show the presentation, but to ask questions, you should have your bar should look similar to this. You may not have quite all of these options, but here is the button that you'll push to ask a question. And this may be at the top or bottom of your interface, depending on what version of Zoom you have and if you have it fully expanded. But go ahead and ask a question. You can offer them up at any point. And like I said, Leslie, we'll stop a few times to answer some questions, and we also will address them with the Q&A at the end. And if you are calling by the phone, but you have access to email, feel free to send me a question at ltcooper@msu.edu. Again, that's ltcooper@msu.edu, and we'll make sure to get your question in. And of course, we do have a time limitation, so if we have outstanding questions, we will work with our speaker and create a document that we'll post online along with the presentation with any additional Q&A that we can't get to. And so with that, I think we're ready for the presentation. Leslie, can you please take over the screen?
Yeah, thank you, Lauren. I will give it my best shot.
Okay.
This one. Okay. And so, Lauren, do you see? I'm starting my slideshow now.
Yeah, it's on, but it's not in presentation view.
All right. How about now?
I think we're seeing the other screen. We're seeing the view that you have.
Okay. So I do new share, and I want to show you my.
There we go.
Is that the right one?
Yep, that's the right one.
All right. Well, congratulations to Zoom for making this so easy.
Good.
And thank you all for joining us on this webinar today. When I was contacted by folks at the Forest Climate Working Group, I was very excited to share news about this new grant program with this group, recognizing that many of you come from diverse backgrounds, maybe not necessarily in the grant-making business, but coming from different aspects of forest management. And hopefully I can share with you this one tool that we have created here in Washington State to preserve forest, working forest land, and give you a little context for where it sits within our state and our efforts in the state to work on protecting forests and do some work on carbon sequestration. So I'm excited to share this with you. Please, as Lauren mentioned, send in your questions. I do think we'll have time for getting to some of those during the presentation. And anything that I'm not able to answer today, if I don't know the answer, I will follow up with you afterwards to find out answers for you from my colleagues here in Washington State. So I'm going to advance the slide now. There we go. So the overview today, I kind of have three main things that I'll present. First is just give you a very brief vision of the amount of forest that we have here in Washington State, and a little bit of structure, our governmental structure. We are somewhat unique here in Washington State because of the way our government is structured and who manages what aspects of forests. Then I'll give you just a brief overview of a couple of examples of carbon sequestration efforts that are happening in the state, and then present to you in detail as an example, one of those examples, our grant program for preserving forest land that we just launched this year. And the goal, of course, recognizing you as the audience, is to talk about forest preservation and the incentive to bring in carbon as one of the management tools for protecting those forests. So a little bit about the agency I work for. It's called the Washington State Recreation and Conservation Office. We're a very small state agency. We are a cabinet level agency that reports to the governor, but we are small. We have about 50 people, and our main focus at our agency is to administer grant programs on behalf of different funding boards. And in this case, it's the Recreation and Conservation Funding Board. It's a governor-appointed board that oversees our work and allocates the grant funding that's provided to it, either through the state legislature or the federal government programs that we administer. So in that regard, a lot of our work is done through an open public meeting process, because our funding board is committed to having a diverse set of audience make our program stronger, transparent, and accountable to the funding sources that we administer. We also provide some technical assistance to our grant applicants about the particular types of things they're working on. And then we also do monitoring of our projects after they're complete to ensure that they're complying with our grant program requirements. And in this particular case, for our Forestland program, those requirements are in perpetuity. So it's a very long-term obligation that we're making as an agency. So just briefly about forest land in Washington State and recognizing that us at the Recreation and Conservation Office are not the experts on managing forest land, but I did want to provide you some background about forests. This information I collected from the Washington Forest Protection Association, which is a private industry group here in the state. But it shows you that the extent of forest that we have in the state. We do have 22 million acres of forest, which is about 40% of the state in forest land. And you can see here that the majority of our forest land is federal. 43% of those acres are federal. And then the next biggest pot of forest land is industrial forest. So think about the warehousers out there owning a number of acres of forest land. And then we do also have a significant amount of non-industrial private forest land, and typically we refer to those folks as our small forest landowners, kind of the mom and pop operations. The state does own about 12% of the forest land, as well as tribes having some holdings and a very small bit of holdings by local government. And that would include our cities, our counties, port districts, and other municipal forms of government. And then just a little bit about our structure in terms of who manages forests in the state. As I mentioned, the Recreation and Conservation Office, where I work, is a governor cabinet level agency. So our grant program is ultimately administered by the governor, which is part of the toolbox that the governor has. But one of the major things that falls under the governor's purview is land use planning, and we have a Growth Management Act here that requires local governments to plan for growth, and as part of that, plan for where forests are important in their local government landscape. So local governments are doing that land use planning at the direction of our State Growth Management Act. And then also within the governor's purview, there are some landowner assistance programs that are administered by other state agencies that help forest landowners out. Now, in addition to our governor as an elected official, we have an elected commissioner of public lands, and that's a person that runs our Department of Natural Resources, which is our main agency that manages forests in the state. So the Commissioner of Public Lands is the one that is issuing permits for timber harvest, implementing what we call our Forest Practices Act. It's also managing our state-owned forests through the state trust. And then it has its own landowner technical assistance programs, as well as some other funding programs, which some of you might be familiar with, like the Forest Legacy Program administered through the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So that's where those programs fit. And it is a separate agency that's headed by a separate elected official. My slides are somewhat slow in moving forward, so I will try to speed that up a little bit. The next thing I wanted to just briefly give you an overview is some examples in the state beyond our grant program that's working to sequester carbon on working forests. There's a couple of different examples that are happening, and I guess I would characterize any of this work as really bubbling up and grassroots oriented. And hopefully these examples will show you how that works here in Washington State in terms of folks really on their own coming up with these ideas to incorporate carbon sequestration in their projects. So the first example, some of you may have heard of, it's called the Mount Rainier Gateway Preserve. It's at the entrance of Mount Rainier near Ashford, Washington. It's property that's owned by a local land trust, the Nisqually Land Trust, and they were able to partner with Microsoft Corporation to purchase carbon credits on the California market. So Microsoft purchased 35,000 carbon credits, which I understand is the equivalent of taking 6,000 cars off the road. And Microsoft paid the Nisqually Land Trust to store the carbon on 520-acre property at this location near Mount Rainier. And that is a project then that was really a partnership between the land trust itself, the Microsoft Corporation, and another organization here called Washington Environmental Council. So it was, again, kind of something that was developed at the desire for Microsoft to find a way to offset some of its carbon emissions. The next example is a new effort that is just being launched called the Southwest Forest Conservation Partnership, and it is taking place on non-industrial private forest land. It's a new project that was awarded funding through the Natural Resource Conservation Service through their Regional Conservation Partnership Program. The state was awarded $1.3 million through our Department of Fish and Wildlife to work with non-industrial forests in the southwest part of our state to work on protecting working forests, but also providing for habitat protection, water quality benefits, flood reduction, recreation, and for carbon sequestration. So this is a new project that's being funded through that federal RCPP program, and we're looking forward to seeing new things come out of that. The last example I'll mention is the proposed cap and trade efforts that our governor has been working on during his administration, and this really is focused more on emissions, capping emissions, and doing a trading program. I mention it here because as part of the governor's package for that proposal, there was a piece of the revenue through that cap and trade program that would go toward preserving forest land. So in that regard, the program that I will talk to you about, our WWRP Forest Land Preservation Program, is in essence a pilot program that may in the future grow and expand based on whether the governor can be successful with some of the cap and trade efforts that he envisions, and generating revenue for further forest land preservation. Then, of course, the focus of the rest of my talk is going to be about our forest land preservation program. But before I get into that, just any questions about kind of the big picture here in Washington State, and I can try to answer those, or I might need to follow up with you afterwards.
Thanks, Leslie. just a kind of broad question. Could you just give us a little insight as far as the leadership and the planning process that's kind of fueling these different avenues that forest carbon is starting to take place in Washington?
Yeah, I can speak to that in the sense that it really is somewhat disjointed. There isn't a landscape scale effort across the state to look at what we could possibly leverage through carbon sequestration and our ecosystem services that might provide. I think part of that comes from the different agencies that we have and the different elected positions. You know, having a governor and then having a separate elected commissioner of public lands, they either need to be on the same page or they're not, in order to put across really a statewide effort that might incorporate the lands that the state owns, private forest lands, and other lands. So it's been really something that's bubbled up and been more of a grassroots, coming from a local perspective or from our land trust and environmental organization agendas. I would say also that the work that I'm going to present to you today is similar in that fashion, that I'll speak to some of the reasons why we even created this forest land preservation grant program, and it wasn't because of some grand scheme that we have about preserving working lands across the state. It really bubbled up from some work that we were doing to improve our grant programs overall, and the need arose organically to create this program. So from that perspective, I think there's an opportunity for some type of work at the landscape scale to look at the, forest land preservation and what we can really harness for carbon.
Thank you for that. That's interesting. We do have another question here about the State of Washington Forest Conservation Partnership. And the question is, what mechanism would be used to register and monitor the forest carbon sequestered through this partnership? Do you know, would it be under something like the Climate Action Reserve Protocol or another one of those sorts of formalized methodologies?
And that's a question about the new effort in the Southwest Washington I was mentioning, is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, the main programs that I believe they're looking to leverage there are the typical NRCS grant programs and technical assistance programs. So the Environmental Quality Incentive Program, the Healthy Forest Reserve grant, Healthy Forest Reserve Technical Assistance Program. So using some of the standard tools that the Natural Resource Conservation Service has in their toolbox, but packaging them up in a concerted effort to work with those private non-industrial forest land owners.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that's it for now. So let's we can move ahead.
Okay. So now I'll give you more information about this new grant program that we just launched last year. And as Lauren mentioned at the beginning, this month we just finished our first round of grant applications and have some lessons learned that I'll share with you at the end. So just as a frame of reference, sometimes I'll flip into our acronym, which is WWRP. That stands for the Washington Wildlife and Recreation Program. The Washington Wildlife and Recreation Grant Program was created in 1990, and my understanding and the experience that I've had is that this is a fairly unique grant program compared to other states across the country, where we are funding at a state level to the tune of $50 to $100 million every 2 years, many different efforts to preserve recreation, habitat, and open space across the state. We have funded thousands of projects since 1990, and this program is still very well supported across the state with its own coalition called the Washington Wildlife and Recreation Coalition that continues to advocate for funding at the state level for this program. As I mentioned earlier, this grant program for forest land preservation bubbled up as a result of a review that we did of how to improve the program since it had been in existence for 25 years. And one of the pieces that came to be as part of that program review was to create this forest land program with 5 main reasons. One was for connectivity across the landscape for working forests, providing for habitat enhancement opportunities, so improving those working lands, their habitat, their ecological health, their forest health, as well as to encourage public access to those private forest lands. As some of you may also experience, private forest lands are starting to close their gates to public access for different reasons. We're experiencing that here in Washington State as well, and that's another one of the incentives of this forest land preservation program. And then in general, just supporting our working lands. We created a farmland and ranchland preservation program about 10 years ago, and this new forest land program really is the next evolution of efforts to protect all our working lands. This next slide shows you how we split up the money, and it's a very complicated slide, and I just want to show for you how broad in scope this grant program is, that we've got outdoor recreation, habitat conservation, and then our farm and forest, our working lands pot of money. So that's called the farm and forest account, and that arrow there is pointing to you to the piece of the pie that this forest land category gets. So overall, 10% of 10% is 1%. In that regard, the forest land category is a very small category compared to this overall grant program, but very fundamental to moving forward with protecting our working lands and those efforts that we've been trying to grow over the last 10 years. What this means for real money is that if we received $100 million from our state legislature, the forest land category would get just under $1 million after we take out for our administrative costs. But just under $1 million would be available to protect forest land every 2 years if we were funded at this level. And we typically are funded between $50 and $100 million with the overall grant program, so it's not unreasonable to expect about $100 million every 2 years for forest land. So a little bit more then about the types of things that are eligible in this new grant program. There's 2 main eligible pieces. One, of course, is to maintain our forests for the opportunity for forest management. And this is being done only through conservation easements. There is not the opportunity to buy outright the forest. And the reason for that is to support our working forest lands, keep them working for us, and simply focus on purchasing the development rights as a core function of the program. Then the other piece of what's eligible for grant funding is enhancement or restoration of a number of different types of ecological functions on the property, whether it's forest health, forest fire management, doing riparian restoration, fish passage for our salmon recovery efforts. Any type of restoration or improvement of forest health is an eligible cost as well in the grant program. It is limited to half of the cost of the easement itself, though, so that it's limited in scope and cost. The next important piece of how this program was created to keep in mind is that it is only eligible to purchase a conservation easement on what we call designated forest land. And designated forest land is a tax status. So it isn't related to the land use planning efforts that a county might be doing to say, here's where we want our forest land to be managed as part of our growth and our growth management planning. It's directly related to the property taxes that a county is collecting. So the county approves which parcels are designated forest land. And those county commissioners are elected officials in each county. So each county has a little bit different approach on how they're implementing their designation process. Some counties require a timber management plan as part of their designation approval, some don't. But in the end, if you do, as a property owner, get approved for designation as forest land, it will reduce your property tax rate, which is the advantage for folks to enroll. Then the other piece of designated forest land is that as a state, our Department of Revenue is collecting that excise tax based on the stumpage value at harvest time. What qualifies then as designated forest land are properties that are 5 or more acres in size, so they can be very small to very large, but the commitment must be from the landowner to grow and harvest timber. That's the trade-off for getting the lower property tax, is that the landowner is committing to generating excise tax in the future. It cannot include a home site, so these are not the, say, hobby farm, hobby forests where somebody might live on the property and have a small forest surrounding them. So those properties are not included here. What that means then, if you think back to that pie chart of 22 million acres of forests in our state, what it translates down to is that about 27% of our forests are eligible in this grant program and are designated as forest land by their counties. So when we created the program, we pulled together an advisory committee of various types of interests who were interested in preserving forest land, from small landowners to industrial forest owners to our own Department of Natural Resources and our Department of Revenue, who's interested in the excise tax, and land trusts as well were also part of our advisory committee. And the committee developed 2 focuses that fit within the statutory framework for the program. So the primary purpose is to preserve opportunities for timber production and that are consistent with local land use planning. Then as a secondary purpose are the other benefits, and this is where carbon sequestration would be considered as a secondary benefit to preserving that working forest. Other secondary benefits might include protecting jobs, providing for that public recreation, and protecting our other ecosystem services, our scenic values, and habitat for wildlife. The program is limited in who is eligible to apply for grants and the amount of money that's available. The folks who can apply for a grant from us are cities, counties, nonprofit nature conservancies, which is our way of defining a land trust, and then one of our state agencies, which is the Washington State Conservation Commission. They're eligible to apply for grants as well. They're the agency that oversees all of our local conservation districts and that partners with the Natural Resource Conservation Service a lot. And Grant requests are limited to $350,000 each grant. So if you think of an example of a project here, it might be a land trust asking us for $350,000 to purchase a conservation easement on a private forest landowner's property. The land trust will need to bring 50% match, so for every dollar we're spending, they're going to spend $1, which results in a minimum project of a $700,000 project. We have a evaluation process that where we recruit folks from outside our agency to evaluate the projects, and I'll share with you the criteria we use for that evaluation here in a second. I just wanted to put this reference up as part of the presentation that anything about this grant program is available for you to take a look at in what we call our manuals that are prepared for each of our grant programs. And I've provided a link here in the PowerPoint to the manual. We call it Manual 10C. But that's just about this forest land preservation program. So you can find lots of information about all the details by clicking on this link if you can access the PowerPoint later. The legislature did require us to consider certain aspects when we're evaluating any of the grant applications. So that team of evaluators that I mentioned that are outside of our agency staff, they have to come together and evaluate the grant applications. And these are the mandatory criteria that the state legislature included when they created the grant program. Things like community support, the likelihood that the property would be converted from a non-timber use is one of the main criteria. And what I want to pull out for you here is that the potential for carbon sequestration is one of our mandatory criteria. So this speaks to the fact that the state legislature was supportive of including carbon sequestration as one of the efforts and one of the management tools for evaluating these projects, along with other attributes like providing for ecosystem services and wildlife habitat. This is a matrix of the evaluation criteria. We created these criteria with that advisory group that I've mentioned that, of forest interest. And I'm not going to go into detail with each of these criteria. They are available in that manual that I mentioned. But what I want to point out to you is that just in the big picture of how we're looking at projects, the most important piece is this first criteria, which we call the viability of the site. And here viability is speaking to the timber production merits of the property. So what is the timber management plan? What's the long-term vision for harvesting? What types of trees are they growing? Where are the markets that they're going to sell to? Those are the most important aspects, and that fits with the primary purpose of the grant program. What's secondary is the forest land stewardship. You see there that it's second evaluation criteria. And forest land stewardship, this is where carbon sequestration is one of the pieces of a number of different things that a forest landowner partnering with one of our applicants might consider as part of their long-term stewardship efforts. And carbon sequestration is one of those things that they can bring up to get points in this scoring matrix. What has been interesting as we've applied this set of criteria for the first time, which are based on the mandatory criteria that the state legislature has given us, there is some tension between the criteria. If you think about the first criteria being about the viability of the site for timber harvest and how you might maximize your potential there for economic productivity, and then balance that with forest stewardship practices that might have other benefits beyond the timber harvest. There is some tension there, and our evaluators are struggling with that. So I'll just highlight that for you now. As I mentioned, we just completed this month our first set of grant application review. We probably had around 8 or 10 applications at the beginning of this effort. But in the end, we ended up with only 3 grant applications. They were all from nonprofit land trusts. So in the end, there was no applications from a city, a county, or our state conservation commission. So those 3 land trusts did all compete, and I can't divulge any results yet because we haven't made them public. We'll do that on Thursday. But if you're interested, I'll be happy to follow up later with the specific projects and how they ranked out and the merits of those projects. Overall, the application metrics are really powerful. I think that those 3 projects would protect 1,200 acres of forest land and purchase 146 development rights. So in that regard, this suite of potential projects really will make a dent in preserving working forest lands from conversion to other uses. So with that, I just want to share with you a few lessons learned so far in this new grant program. The first one, as I alluded to earlier, there is no statewide strategy about storing carbon across the landscape. So in that regard, people are really figuring things out on their own, trying to take examples from other places. One of the reasons why I'm excited about getting introduced to this group is I'd love to hear more about what other states are doing myself. What's happening here is that some counties are really taking this on for themselves. For example, King County, which is where the city of Seattle is located, our biggest metropolitan county, they really are looking at their own carbon budget within the county and developing their own game plan for how they want to leverage their working forest. So that's happening at our county level. So things are happening on a piecemeal basis, but nothing statewide. The next lesson learned is that we are in need of more technical assistance on that balance of how to manage a working forest, make it economically viable, and how to also leverage income from storing carbon. I think there's some real opportunities there for that carbon sequestration, as we have examples already happening where folks are buying in the California market already. That how can we do more of that here in Washington State to work with programs that are outside our state, in the hopes that in the future we will have our own cap and trade system here in Washington. One of the best resources that I've found on how to do this is through our county extension offices. Our forest extension agents seem to be the most knowledgeable on how to do this. So I'm looking forward to building more relationships with those county forest extension agents. The next interesting piece to share with you is that of those 3 applicants, only one of them mentioned the benefits of carbon sequestration in their application. So thinking about those 3 applicants, all being land trusts, all being in the conservation framework mindset, it was interesting from my perspective that only one of them was thinking about carbon in the future. And that particular land trust was looking at all of their holdings, so it wasn't just about this particular easement that they would be acquiring, but all of their land holdings and looking at how they can assess the carbon budget within their own organization's holdings and then start to leverage that for being available for carbon credits on the market. A next interesting piece is that there are diverse opinions about the types of forest that we should protect. And I don't know if this is happening in other places across the country, but the idea that where is the biggest threat to our forests related to conversion? And this speaks to that issue of land use planning and where is the best place on the ground for us as a state to invest our resources in protecting forests. Is it in those private industrial forests that are selling off property and getting out of the forestry business? Is it in the smaller landowners who have non-industrial sized forests? Or is it a different model where we might want to focus on community forestry and working on protecting forests that are part of a community landscape and managed at a community level? So that debate, I think, is still out there for us as a grant program. Another lesson learned through this process is that our land trust partners really would prefer to own forests outright. This program was set up as a conservation easement program. As I mentioned, the purpose for that was to keep working forests working. And there's a perception here in our state legislature that land trusts, once they own a piece of property, that it's for conservation purposes only, and it would not be managed so much for as a working forest anymore. So in that regard, this program is not set up for fee acquisition, but in speaking with our land trusts and finding out what their bigger interests are, they're looking to buy forests outright and manage them for some economic productivity to help finance their operations overall. And then the last lessons learned for us as a new grant program is that we likely should have included Native American tribes as one of the eligible applicants. They are an important player here in Washington State. They are co-managers of many of our natural resources here. I believe we have 29 tribes in the state. So they are an important piece of talking about forests and forest health and forest preservation, and we should have included them as an eligible applicant so that they could be part of the process and preserving forests. So with that, I would just like to say thank you for inviting me to be part of this webinar. I have really enjoyed my conversations with your organizers, Lauren, and this has been a great opportunity for us to think about our small pilot grant program and how it might turn into bigger and better things. So with that, I'll finish with any other questions and leave you here with my contact information.
Thank you very much, Leslie. This was a wonderful presentation. It's given us a lot of insight, and we have some questions and about 10 minutes to address them. So I will, I'll start bringing those up right now. I do have one quick question here. Somebody asked, has conserving the marbled murrelet habitat been part of the program? And I may not be saying that right, but I don't know if you're familiar with that. Marbled murrelet?
Yeah, you're close. It's the marbled murrelet. It's a bird on the endangered species list. It's certainly a major factor here in preserving forests, habitat for that species. It is definitely still a hot button issue from a working forest perspective, and quite frank, I mean, we're probably going beyond much of my expertise here, but my understanding is that the reason for a lack of harvest on our federal forest lands is related a lot to protecting for that species. Our private forest landowners are entering into habitat conservation plans with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And in that regard, we have excluded protecting forest land that would be included in a habitat conservation plan from being eligible for funding. So in that regard, this grant program isn't being used to leverage protecting marbled murrelet habitat for private landowners' endangered species compliance.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Another question we have here, will Washington's legislature's failure to pass a capital budget for 2017-2018 get in the way of the funding for the 3 applications you've received?
Yes, it is a hurdle for us. For those of you in the rest of the country, we are at a stalemate right now in getting a new capital budget approved. I mentioned we typically get 50 to 100 million for our overall Washington Wildlife and Recreation program. That funding should have come into play on July 1st of this year, but we did not get any capital budget, so it wasn't just our grant funding that was affected, but it was all the state's capital projects, including schools and hospitals. So it is affecting our award of grant funds. We have completed our grant evaluation process, and these projects are ready to go as soon as the state legislature approves that capital budget.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Another question here is, could a carbon offset project developer provide the matching funds for an applicant? And that the question also says that this would then mean that the applicant would follow a carbon offset protocol to generate carbon credits and offsets with that forest.
Yes, I think that could work. And I think there are ways that someone could bring that type of match to the table. They would need to clearly articulate the carbon restrictions on the property, as well as then how they're going to harvest in the future. So our advisory committee members think that's possible, and it's a matter of that technical assistance of bringing that money to the table and then figuring out the forest management plan that would allow for both things to happen.
Thank you for that. So we have another question that's really linked to the offset market. And I know that you said only one of the 3 explicitly mentioned carbon, but the question is, do you think that there's an added incentive, or the added incentive of the Forestland Preservation Grant could encourage more exploration in carbon markets for landowners?
Yes, I hope that happens. And that's why I'm really interested in continuing these kinds of conversations. Our land trust, the Nisqually Land Trust, where I mentioned they had partnered with Microsoft to bring carbon offset credits to their property near Mount Rainier. We have a great example of a land trust doing that, bringing in that funding to protect their property. So we've got good examples of that, and I think we need to see more of those types of projects, and hopefully this grant program can help encourage that.
Thank you so much. And then another kind of broad question here is, you mentioned earlier that there wasn't necessarily a cohesive landscape plan for this topic, but what types of information and knowledge sharing do you think is required at this time around forest carbon and forest carbon management? And do you think that there are, or where do you think there are fundamental knowledge gaps? And then the last part would be, how do we overcome those gaps? Is it training, programming, outreach? What are your general thoughts here?
One of the things that I'm hopeful for on that front is one of our state environmental organizations here, the Washington Environmental Council, is continuing to work on this issue about working forests, climate change, and the cap and trade revenue benefits of protecting those working forests. And they're continuing that conversation. They're even having their own get-together later in September of this month. So it seems to me that one of our best approaches right now is for our nonprofit partners to help us frame that discussion up. The other the other thing to keep our eye on here in Washington State is that we do have a new Commissioner of Public Lands. So that's the duly elected person managing all that forest permitting and state forest lands. Her name's Hillary Franz, and she's just been on the job since January. And there's likely some new things that will come out of the State Department of Natural Resources on this front. So I think that there's some new things happening here in Washington State to keep our eye on with our new commissioner, our governor still wanting us to be bold on addressing climate change, and then our nonprofit partners helping us with that conversation.
So we're almost to the end here, so I'll ask a final, pretty broad question. From your perspective, then, what is the path forward for carbon management in Washington from this point?
Well, I'm not sure that from my perspective I can answer that. What I think I can, how I think I can answer that is from an agency that is managing a grant program related to protecting working forest land. What we need is the technical support to understand where the best investments can be made, and that we have a pot of money that's available to leverage other sources of money to protect the forests that are, say, located in the right spot, have the right type of, the best carbon value, and help us figure out where on the landscape that is. Because that would really help us figure out some focus for this grant program. Right now, it's kind of a wide open door for any type of forest to come in as a potential project. But if there's a way for us to focus more on how we can better fine-tune our investments, that would be really helpful.
Great.
Lauren, this is Jad. Can I step in for a moment?
Absolutely, yep.
Yeah, folks, again, this is Jad Daly again from American Forests and co-chair of the Forest Climate Working Group. And actually two things. First of all, Leslie, I think what you just said resonates strongly for other states that we've talked to around the country. And there's some materials that the Forest Climate Working Group developed a couple of years ago as the EPA Clean Power Plan was being developed, intended to begin from a policy development point of view, start to provide some guidance and some technical assistance for how states could think about that kind of strategic planning that you were talking about. And I think there's more work still that could be done to take some of those policy ideas and connect them to the sort of statewide strategic area planning that you were just talking about. But a new tool that should be available sometime in the not too distant future is a carbon map, that an online carbon map that's being developed by the Trust for Public Land. And this is intended to be an easy to use online carbon mapping tool that could enable states and other organizations, governments and other and private sector organizations to do some of that analysis around where do we have high carbon stocks in the land, where do we have key risks to carbon, and how can we start to understand where the opportunities are to create incentives that can integrate working forests and carbon sequestration and carbon sustainability. So that's just an example of the kinds of resources that are being developed. And so we'd love to stay in conversation with you and the folks in Washington State and any other states that might be represented here on the phone. We've really been eager to create a kind of a technical assistance conversation where we can help you all find some of those resources that are available and identify the best ways to use them.
Jad, thanks for that. And when I post the link to this recording and any supplemental materials here, I'll go ahead and link to the resources that you just mentioned as well.
That sounds great. Thank you, Lauren. And the one other comment I wanted to make, first of all, I wanted to say again, great thanks to you, Leslie, for a wonderful presentation, and to you, Lauren, for organizing a really great and helpful session. And also another note to folks on the phone who might not be at this point engaged with the Forest Climate Working Group, that we're always looking for new participants to be in our informational network, and we're also in the process of adding new members to the Forest Climate Working Group through a formal endorsement process that we have of a set of entry principles that we've developed. So if you'd like to engage in learn more about the Forest Climate Working Group and how you can become engaged, as part of the follow-up, we can also send out our contact information, and you can reach out to us by email to learn more about the Forest Climate Working Group.
Okay, thanks so much, Jad. So if that's everything, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. I just want to say a couple more thank yous. Thanks to a big thank you to Leslie, of course, and then also to Dave Cleaves, who's been very helpful in working with me closely on developing this, and of course to Jad Daly and Narita Height for their leadership in the Forest Climate Working Group. And just finally, I'll take this this screen from Leslie, so we can share the final slide here with contact information. So feel free to contact me if you have any questions, and my contact information is on here as well. So thank you so much for all of your time. Thanks again to Leslie for the presentation and for your time today as well. And take care. We'll be in touch soon with some follow-up information. Have a great rest of your afternoon.